This time we look at 5 more underrated motorcycles. It can sometimes feel as though the motorcycle market or motorcycle buyers are rather sheep-like in their choices. Lots of people all trying to scrabble around trying to buy the same machines. This is all well and good, but it does mean that many machines which are equally as good simply don't get the praise or the attention that they deserve. And so, here are 5 more underrated motorcycles. The Honda NSR 250. Produced between 1987 and 1999, this exquisitely manufactured and designed two-stroke can sometimes be overlooked compared to the larger capacity or more powerful machines that were available at the time. The machine uses a 249cc 90-degree V-twin two-stroke engine, which is of course water-cooled, although it doesn't use a power valve system like most of its competitors. Instead, the inlet manifold is adjusted for length automatically by the machine, thus allowing for a very smooth power delivery. Of course, compared to its rivals from the 3 other main Japanese manufacturers, the NSR can seem somewhat underpowered, with just 45 horsepower, although 45 horsepower is of course no mean feat from a 250. Now, this horsepower limit was pretty much imposed because it's a Japanese domestic market machine, but the benefit of this for a European buyer is that the bike is incredibly flexible. There's no jackhammer power delivery, there's no sudden snatch. The bike is almost like a 4-stroke, it gradually builds power. Of course it does go faster and faster as the revs build, but that delivery is very smooth and very linear. It's really surprising, and to be honest, when we had one of these, we found that it was much smoother and a much nicer power delivery than say a GSX-R 400 that we'd had earlier. Even the fuel economy figures aren't too bad actually. They're not fantastic, but for a two-stroke they really are very good. This of course stands in stark contrast to the larger machines, 500s and 750s and the like, because the fact is two-strokes really don't work as well as the capacity grows, and 250 for me is the optimum size. The machine was developed with 3 main models, the MC18, the MC21 and the MC28. The performance of all these machines in terms of engine power is very similar, although the chassis do vary from bike to bike. And that chassis really is the trump card for this bike. The brakes are stunning by the standards of the time, as is the suspension, because these Japanese domestic market bikes were really built to an extremely high standard. But the chassis is incredibly competent, and really gives you more confidence than you would ever have on any other machine that I've ever ridden. It is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the best handling bike I've ever ridden in my life. And while in truth, to be blunt, it is bloody awful in traffic, your neck gets cramped very quickly, as do your wrists and knees, all this is instantly forgotten as soon as you point the finger at a twisty road. Absolutely the most fun you can have on 2 wheels, and a bike that truly proves you don't need 200 horsepower to have a fantastic time. Absolutely the best bike I've ever ridden, in terms of cornering at least. The Hinckley Triumph Trident. The Trident was one of the first bikes to come out of the all-new Hinckley factory in 1991, and in 750 and 900cc forms this popular little machine would run all the way till 1998, when it was replaced by a more modern, more lightweight machine. The bike used a chassis that would be familiar to Panther owners everywhere, and an engine which bears more than a close resemblance to Kawasaki's GPZ 900, although in truth of course this is a 3-cylinder engine and not a 4 like the Kawasaki. But there are some basic fundamental design similarities. But in truth, the Trident Triple has a character all of its very own. The engine isn't the most powerful. The 750 shorter stroke engine makes around 90 horsepower, with around 100 horsepower on tap, at the crank at least, for the 900. These were in truth fairly modest performance figures by the standards of the time, but the 3-cylinder engine made fantastic mid-range torque much better than most of the 4-cylinder competition, giving them a performance which sat somewhere between the V-twins and the 4-cylinders then very popular. Erring on the side of caution, the Hinckley factory somewhat over-engineered these machines, which can translate to mean they're a little bit heavy, and they're also a little top-heavy into the turns, But don't be fooled, these are excellent handling machines. The chassis works extremely well. It is perhaps though a generation or so behind the Japanese of the time. These big under-stress motors can run up impressively high mileages without giving any trouble at all, so make a really good second-hand buy, with the only notable failure, the occasional breakdown of the starter sprite gear. The longer stroke 900 bikes were commercially fairly successful, but not so the 750s. They sold in very tiny numbers, being not too dissimilar in price to the 900, but not having quite the same mid-range. That said, the triple engine does give very good performance, and compared to most other 750s of the time, you would find that the engine really is very torquey in the middle. So the 750 is a bike that's very much undervalued, and so can make a real bargain if you're in the market for one of these bikes. The Trident, and the 900 in particular, has been described as one of the very best of the early Hinckley machines, but they are all too often passed over in favour of the later, lighter and more exotic designs, which is good news for us because it does mean they make a really good bargain. So if you're in the market for a large muscular motorcycle and you want something British in particular, the Trident could be an excellent choice for you. The ARIEL Arrow. The ARIEL Arrow and its leader touring stablemate represent the swan song for one of Britain's greatest ever motorcycle designers, one Valentine Page. Page is probably best remembered today for being the father of the Gold Star, and for various other models, right the way from these early days at the Brooklyn circuit in the 1920s. The machine is clearly influenced by the German designs of the period, with its parallel twin, roughly square dimensioned two-stroke engine, and of course pressed steel frame. It really was groundbreaking, however, for the British motorcycle industry at the time. You will read articles that describe the bike as a commercial failure. This is not actually true, and the first few years sales were actually pretty good, although they did tail off somewhat later on, mainly due to a lack of development. In fact, the machine was in production until 1965, and was only really killed off because Berman, who supplied the gearboxes, stopped production of that particular type of gearbox. BSA did consider putting one of their own gearboxes into it, but thought that the retooling necessary simply wasn't worth the trouble, and the bike was allowed to quietly die. For me, rather surprisingly, this bike does turn up in the worst bikes sections when people compile these rather dodgy cut and paste lists on the internet. I strongly believe that these have been written by people who've never actually even seen an aerial leader or an Arrow. In fact, one such article even comments about the bike's dodgy handling and poor ground clearance, whereas in fact by 1960 standards the opposite is true, and the engine in fact performs just as well as pretty much any other British 250 of the period, and much better than quite a few. The leading link suspension fitted does provide a reasonable ride, although you certainly wouldn't want to take the bike off-road. And if the bike does have a weak link, it's undoubtedly the fact that the front brake isn't particularly good. Again, not exactly uncommon for bikes of the period. But it was certainly outbraked by some of its competition, although it was definitely not outperformed through the corners, as many articles may suggest. Because in truth the leader is an excellent machine that was completely let down by the BSA parent company that failed to see the potential for the design, choosing to focus their resources on the development of their own C15 four-stroke models. Kawasaki Kz 750 Twin. And when you think of Kawasaki's of this period, and it's the 1970s, you tend to think of 650, 900 and 1000cc four-cylinder motorcycles, and with a 750 thrown in too. You don't normally think about parallel twins, but Kawasaki did indeed build them, starting at first with the KZ or KZ 400 in 1975. They enlarged the machine out to 750 from 1976 to 1979. Kawasaki described the bike as something of a tourer, not surprisingly with only around 55 horsepower on tap, which isn't bad performance for a parallel twin, but fairly modest by the standards of the four cylinders then around. And despite only having the two cylinders, the bike was surprisingly heavy, with a dry weight of 218 kilos or 480 pounds. It may surprise some today to note that Kawasaki actually made use of a 360-degree crank, rather like the British twins of years before. This is because at lower speeds this provides very smooth running, This layout will of course result in some vibration, but in the Kawasaki this is much reduced when compared to earlier machines of the 1960s. So for change, this was one big twin that could actually handle motorways in relative comfort. So here was a machine that was relatively inexpensive, nicely styled, well put together and reliable, and delivered the punch of say a Triumph TR6, so you might have expected them to sell like hotcakes. But in fact it was only ever a fairly modest seller. It seems that people just wanted 4-cylinder bikes, because they were very much the on-trend bike of the time, it seems. And the same unfortunately is very much true today. If people want to buy a 1970s Kawasaki, they invariably aim for the 4-cylinder bikes, leaving the twin-cylinder 400 and 750s somewhat overlooked. This is a great shame because they are very capable, very nicely engineered machines, and definitely bikes worthy of a little bit more attention. The Royal Enfield Interceptor. Produced by Royal Enfield at their Redditch factory between 1960 and 1970, the Interceptor was their top-of-the-range sports model. The very first machines to carry the name were introduced in 1960 and were a fairly limited production run using the 692cc engine originally found in the Constellation, but somewhat tuned up to give a bit more extra power. These of course were primarily intended for the American market. In '62 the Series 1 arrived with its 736cc engine. The Interceptor was a mighty machine, easily capable of over 100 miles an hour, but it was the torque that really set the bike apart. Riders at the time felt that it was the only machine on the road that really felt like the mighty V-twins of the pre-war era. And the bike was surprisingly refined too, because Royal Enfield were the only company at the time that both statically and dynamically balanced its crankshafts before engine assembly. If the bike did have a weakness, it was the Berman gearbox. It was solid enough, but it was rather clunky and rather pedestrian for a machine of this kind of power and nature. At the end of the 60s came the Series 2, regarded by some writers as possibly the best parallel twin ever produced by the British industry, at least in the classic period. Smooth and powerful, the bike made around 56 horsepower and at a top speed of almost 120 miles an hour. And it employed true wet sump lubrication. But the problem for Royal Enfield was by that point they'd been taken over by Manganese Bronze Holdings. They didn't really have any interest in Royal Enfield and were mainly concentrated on producing their Norton models. They closed the Redditch factory because the land it stood on was quite simply worth more than the company itself. Production of the Interceptor 2 did continue, but in an underground bunker further to the south. You really couldn't make this up, could you? But it wasn't long before Manganese Holdings completely lost interest in Royal Enfield altogether and shut production down completely, leaving the 800cc Interceptor 3 series stillborn. A sad end for a very fine motorcycle. What collections of motorcycles would you like to see a video on in the future? Please message us below. And if you did like that video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.